Welcome to this beautiful country road tutorial. You're going to enjoy painting this one. It's quite a serene setting. We are going to start off just by showing you where I miscuted. I did use some miscut on the big tree trunks on the left, a little bit of grasses, and especially some of the taller grasses on the right that are right before the row of the darker pine trees. So you want to get those little bits of miscut on because that's going to save you a lot of grief later on. Brushes, we're using our nice big 2-inch flat. We're going to be using a number 6 and a number 2 round. We're going to be using our number 1 rigger and a fine liner. And we are definitely going to be using a wisp. If you don't have a wisp, a fan. We'll be using our sponge for sponging in our trees. We're going to be using salt for sure. And the colors that we're going to go with today, beautiful cerulean blue for the sky. If you want your sky to be a little bit grayer, you can put a little bit of black to your cerulean and make a still gray. Definitely some indigo. We're going to be using our sap green, quite a bit of sap green for our greenery. We are going to be using black to darken our sap in areas and definitely for the road. And then we will be using some burnt umber. We're going to be using some yellow ochre for the grasses, and we will be using some cad red in our barn. We do not have to wet the background today, the sky. We're just going to make our puddle of cerulean blue nice and wet so that we put it on and it stays nice and wet so that we can blot out our clouds. We're going to be blotting out the clouds with a Kleenex. I'm bringing my cerulean blue all the way down to where the tops of my barn would be or my silos, working around those areas with a smaller brush, but keeping it very wet so that I still will have time to go back in and blot out my clouds where I want them. Make sure your coloring, your paint is very, very, very wet. It doesn't matter if it's too wet, it only matters if it's too dry. So make sure you have some nice wet color. You don't have to wet your background, just get your whole sky colored in, come down towards your horizon line. It's a nice lighter blue, so it's not going to affect the color of our darker trees. Once you get your sky on and you are happy with where your sky is, you can go ahead and soften the edge into just where the grass is with a little bit of water. Make sure you're still nice and wet, and then you're going to use a Kleenex or a paper towel. Wipe off your table. Make sure your table's wiped off so you don't get any washback. And then we're going to get another paper towel or Kleenex, and we're going to blot out our clouds. Don't get too carried away with your clouds. Plan them in advance. You don't want to have all of your clouds blotted off where you have your tall trees later. So make sure you plan where you want your clouds to be. Blot them lightly with your Kleenex, and then we're going to let that dry nice and well before we get anything else, mainly because we're going to be using some salting and you don't want to get salt in your wet sky. So you want to make sure your clouds are how you want them. Make sure that once the paint settles in, if it's going to come back in on you, you're going to have to blot again. So pay attention to your clouds until you're happy with them. Now I'm going to let my clouds dry, and I'm going to mix a little bit of burnt umber and a little bit of yellow ochre. And if you look along the sides of your road, you'll see where you have those lighter colors of the dried grasses. I'm going to put those in first mixing my burnt umber, a little bit of yellow ochre, and I'm going to dry brush off the sides. So I'm going right up to the edge of my road with that color. This again is burnt umber and a little bit of yellow ochre. I'm going to do it on both sides, and then I'm going to dry brush the edge off, not the edge closest to the road, but the edge in the other direction. I'm going to dry that off horizontally, and we're going to bring our other color up into that later. But you want to go ahead and put those colors on and dry brush off the edge. You're dry brushing horizontally in the other direction. And we're going to let that dry a bit. Okay, now I'm going to work on one side at a time. I'm going to work on my left side first. I'm using some watered down sap green, and I'm going to paint in my field, nice and wet. And after I paint in my field, then I'm going to dry brush the sap green back over into my yellow ochre color so that I still have a rough edge. You don't have to worry right now about painting the entire side. Where all of your big trees are, we're going to be sponging later. So don't worry about painting behind that right now, because you can just fill in the little holes later. But where the area where your biggest part of your field is, that is just going to be the field, you want to go ahead and paint that in nice and wet. There's two sections to the field. I'm doing the top section first, and I am dry brushing both vertically along the edge to keep a rough edge and horizontally along the right edge. And I'm doing that right edge into that yellow ochre area. So I'm still going to have it looking like there's a lot of rough grasses growing into each other. You don't want just a perfectly smooth line. I'm also doing an edge along the road. If you forget to do that, you can always add that in. But again, that grass beside the road is both green and yellow ochre colored, so you can put it where you want it to be. Now you want to let that dry really well before we go ahead and go into putting in some of our trees. I'm going to start to put in some of the separate individualized trees before I do the background trees. So back by the area where my barn is, so I know how much of my barn and silo area I have to paint. I'm going to go ahead and put in my individual trees. I'm making them a little bit darker, so I mixed my sap with a little bit of indigo. And if you follow your picture, you can see where those trees are. I'm doing that big individual tree like at the end of the road first on the left. And then once that's painted in, I can go ahead and follow through with some of the other ones. But you want to be able to see exactly where your barn is so that you can put your trees around that. If you don't have that barn sketched in, well, you better do that now. I'm throwing a little bit of salt on that tree so that I can get a little bit of texture from that. My sky is definitely dry, so I don't have to worry. And while my tree is still wet, I'm dropping in a little bit of black at the base, and that's going to give that tree a little bit of depth so it doesn't just look like a flat green pancake. Now once that tree is dry, then I'm going to go ahead and put in my row of trees behind my barn. Just a nice straight line above my white roof of my barn. And then I am going to dry brush vertically in an upward position to show an uneven an uneven area of the tops of my trees. I'm just doing that with my brush, dry brushing, poking around with my brush. I'll do the same thing with that. You can throw a little bit of salt on that. And I'm also going to be putting on some salt or some black in at my base, just little dots to give those trees some depth also. I'm going to work all of that. I'm going to allow that to dry, and I'm going to move on to a couple of my bigger front trees, and I'm sponging these. I'm using sap mixed with black. You want to sponge where you have your tree trunks. That's the purpose of sketching those in. I'm sponging with my sponge the tips of my sponge. Don't press too hard. You want to just have the tips of your sponge making all those nice loose leaves. Then you're going to go back in with your brush. I dipped my brush into some sap mixed with some black. I'm dropping it in sporadically on my tree where I have the nice wet sponging, allowing that color to move around within my already wet sap. And then I'm pulling out some little fine edges with my nice thin rigger. Then you're going to throw on a little bit of salt, and we're going to move on to the next tree on your left. And we're going to try to get some of our trees in now so that we know where the other grassy sections will be, or where our forward colored little mound of grass is going to be. We're going to work this one at a time. Again, I'm using my sap mixed with a little bit of black. Now I'm sponging in my second tree. This one is a little bit shorter and wider. And I will do the same thing, nice and wet, just putting the tips of my brushes down. You don't want big solid splots of green. You want just little tips to touch to give that real leafy look. But where the most of the wet paint is, then I'm going to go back in with my brush. My brush dipped in with my sap mixed with a little bit of black. I'll pull out some of my edges with my little rigger so that my tree looks very full of nice individual leaves. Dropping in some of that darker color. And I'll throw some salt on that one also. Now you'll notice that these trees are at an angle because that's a hillside there. So I'm pulling the base down at an angle so that I don't have a tree that is flat straight across the bottom. This is helping to give you the angle of the landscape. Drop your darker black in at the base. A couple spots along the upper section of the tree, again, because this is going to give you that look of the depth of the branches and the deepness of those branches. And then you're going to allow that to dry. Throw on a little bit of salt if you would like. If you want to even put a little bit of color into it, you can drop in a little bit of ochre. You can drop in a little bit of red. You can drop in a little bit of umber if you'd like. But we're going to wait for all of that to dry before we do any more trees on the left-hand side. We're going to move to the right-hand side now, and we're going to start to sponge in some of those trees. Now the trees that I'm sponging in there, I'm sponging in right above where I miscuted those grasses, because that's like the tree line up against that field. On this one, I am dropping in a little bit of ochre just to make it a little bit lighter, because the trees behind that one I want to be a little bit deeper, and I will put a little bit of black up against this light one to really make that light tree stand out. But I'm doing it the same way, a little bit of black to show some of the depths in those leaves, pulling out some edges with my rigger and throwing on a little bit of salt. Now while that one on the right is drying, I'm going to go back to the left and I'm going to put in that tree that is in between these two. If you look at your picture, you'll see that you can see some of the white roof of a barn through that. So you don't want to fill it in solidly, but you want to fill in enough that it certainly looks like a full tree. But you will see the tree trunk on this one, and you will see a lot of branches on this one. So some of that area I'm filling in with my brush, but I don't want to fill it in too much because I want to be able to see that nice white roof through this tree. Use your fine rigger to pull out some branches. You can always add, but you can't take away, so don't get too heavy-handed with this. You want to make sure you're working around the trees that are already dry. So that's why I'm putting some black around that, because that's going to push those other two trees forward. You don't want everything to remain all the same color. You want to make sure you're filled in around where your misket is. And I'm also going to add a little bit of color on that dried misketed branch off of that one tree, because I don't want to forget about putting a little bit of foliage at the end of that branch. So where that little misketed branch is, I'm going to put in just a little bit of color, not a whole lot, but just enough so that my eye will follow that tree. I'm going to go back now and add some more of the longer trees in the background and fill in all along the top of my roof there to my barn. Same thing, filling it in with my color and then dry brushing off the top edge or just painting it off however you feel most comfortable doing it. But you want to make sure that you are outlining your barn roof now and in between your silos. That's what's going to help to push those forward too. Make sure when you do this you get a nice straight line on your barn roof. You don't want your barn roof to be sagging. And I'm going to start now to sponge another tree on my right hand side. My big pine tree in the foreground. There's a couple trees there. When you're doing multiple trees, you want to give one time to dry before you add others. Again, sponging in my color, pulling out some edges, and then I'm going to add a little bit of black at the base to give the trees, the branches, some depth. Don't make it solid black. You want to put in your black and you want to move that black around because you're trying to show depth of branches, not the whole tree. So you want to move that around and allow it to look like there's branches on it also. We're going to fill in our other trees. You can see how they are filled in. All of the white spaces in between will be filled in later with the greens that would be behind those trees. But now we want to go ahead and work on our fields. I'm putting a lighter color down first of yellow ochre, and then I'm going to be dragging my sap green through that yellow ochre. I want to have these foreground fields more visible color, not just solid greens. There's already so much green in the picture with all of the trees and the background fields that now I want some lighter color. So I put in my yellow ochre first. I'm dry brushing off the edge coming towards the road. And while that yellow ochre is wet, that's why it's so nice and wet. While it's wet is when I'm going to be dragging through my sap green, because I want my sap green to have a very soft blend to it. I don't want hard edges. So while it's nice and wet, I'm going to be dragging through my sap green. You can drag through your sap green with your big 2-inch brush or your smaller number 2 or number 6. Again, however you're most comfortable. But don't forget you want to dry brush off your edges of your ochre first. I'm still nice and wet with that ochre color. And then I'll mix my sap green into a little puddle. My sap green is nice and wet, and I am just dragging that through, not everywhere because I want to leave sections of that yellow ochre. So I'm just dragging it through here and there, allowing it to blend as it wants to, the wet on wet. Same will go on the other side, wet on wet, sap green, and I'll throw on some salt, but not until I get all of my color where I want it, where I'm happy with it. My yellow ochre color up against my dark pine trees. I want to leave some of that yellow ochre right up against those pine trees because that's what's showing, that's going to help to pop out my pines. You can always add some sap. So don't get too heavy-handed on your sap green right off the bat. You want to go ahead and put some in. We can always add some later. We're going to be adding some grasses with our wisp brush later. And then you can throw on a little bit of salt if you would like to. We're going to add a little bit of that sap green now on the right-hand side of the yellow ochre grass. Up the side, leave some, don't get too carried away, don't get too heavy-handed. Pull out your color onto your road. And then leave it alone. Now you want to let your salt work. Try to take off as much as you can because now we're going to put our road color on and we don't want salt on our road. I mixed some cerulean blue with my black, a lot of water, and you get a nice steel gray color. I'm doing both sections of my road separately. So I'm doing the upper section first, painting in the whole road, and I'm painting it lighter first because it'll get a darker wash put on it later in the middle. But you want to have that nice lighter steel gray color down first and allow that to dry. No salt, no nothing, just that nice steel gray color all the way down the sides. Then when you get up closer to the front, you can go ahead and do the front. It's okay to do it with the back section still a little bit wet, but I didn't want you going everywhere and then having the front section start to dry on you. So do the back section first, then go ahead and you're using the same color to paint in the whole front section, all the way up to the grass, all the way up to the yellow ochre part. once you get that all painted in, then you want to go ahead and allow that to dry. It should be nice and smooth. We're not salting it. We're not doing anything on this wash. We're just leaving it dry. And while it's drying, we're going to go ahead and go up and work on our silos. But we're not going to do anything more on the road until it's dry. On your silos, I used that same still gray color, but I added just a tiny bit more black. If you want to, you could add a tiny bit more indigo. And I'm painting in those two silos. Now, if you want one of your silos to be a different color, if you want a red silo or whatever, you can go ahead and paint whatever color you want on your silos. But you want to go ahead and paint both of your silos in. I'm leaving my tops not painted because I'm just going to dry brush some color on the tops later. Let those silos dry. And then after they are dry, I'm going to go ahead and I mixed a little bit of cad red with some burnt umber, and I'm painting in my red on my barn colors. Wherever you see that red, if you didn't see a barn back in there where I'm painting, that's fine. It can just be greenery. But if you did, you're going to go ahead and paint that in with your cad red mixed with a little bit of burnt umber. And you're going to paint that other barn closest to the road the same color on the bottom. We're leaving the roof white. Allow that to dry. It's looking very much like a country road right now. So while that's drying, we're going to go back in. We're going to put another wash on the road. The wash that we're going to put on the road is going to be a darker color. And that darker color is going to be the same that we put down, but I added a little bit of extra black to it to make it a little bit darker. We're leaving an edge on both sides of the lighter color. So you're going to have your darker still gray color, and on the edges, your lighter still gray color. You're going to paint that all the way back to the top of the road. Now remember, those little edges are going to get thinner as you get farther away. So they're not going to be real thick when you get to the top of the road. You're going to barely see them when you get to the top of the road. Go around any tree branch that's hanging over. No salt or anything on this because it's too far away to see any texturing. The front section though, we're going to be doing some dry brushing first. And if you look at your picture, you're dry brushing where the tire tracks would be from the cars that are constantly driving on those roads. That's where most of the texturing is. So I'm dry brushing horizontally in two sections. I'll connect some of the sections, but not all of them, because I do want some of that road to remain that same light color. Look at your picture, decide where you are going to leave some of the color lighter. You can deepen it here and there simply by adding a little bit more black to your color. You can throw salt on it here and there, but don't get carried away with your salting. On my back road, I'm going to do a little tiny bit of dry brushing, not a whole lot, but I'm going to dry brush going up the road, give it a little bit of texture that way, deepening the farthest section of the road slightly with another wash of color. That'll make it look like the road has a little bump to it before it continues on. You can see how nice the salting has worked. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. It's the luck of the salt shaker. But now you want to go ahead and take off as much salt as possible once everything is nice and dry, because now we're going to be putting in our nice big tree trunks and branches. So you want to take off your salt. You want to go ahead and put your branches in. Now you want to put your tree trunks in first. Take off your misket, follow your tree trunk, paint your tree trunk in. My tree trunks are umber mixed with some black. And then your branches are going to come off of your tree trunk. Your branches can't just be out in the middle of the air. They have to come off something. So I'm putting my tree trunks in, and then I'm going to follow those tree trunks up into the biggest sections of my trees. Your branches can be different widths, so you can use a rigger, you can use your number 2 brush, but you want to get your branches to look like they are accommodating all of the foliage on the trees. That big branch is coming off of my trunk, going into that big section of my tree. You'll have smaller branches going off to the side. You're going to have little thin dead branches into your sky area if you want. You're going to have branches that are going to go off to the right and go off to the left. Study your trees before you start to paint. If you feel like you need to, you can sketch them in with a pencil before you start to paint. But you don't want to have branches where there's not enough foliage to accommodate what you're putting in there. You're going to remove the rest of your misket for your big tree trunks. The one tree trunk on the left-hand side, because of the way all of the light is hitting it, it's very light in color. So it's just a very pale grayish color. And just the right-hand side of it is going to be shadowed. So you don't want to paint that whole tree trunk dark. That's going to be a lighter color, not dark. The right-hand side will be shadowed later because the right-hand side is the shadowed section of the trees. The sun is coming from the left to the right. That tree is all in shadow, so that one can be painted in darker. And again, you're going to make some branches off to the sides. And eventually we'll take off the misket for that dead tree branch. And the only color on that is going to be a real light gray color also. But the underside of the thickest part of the branch, we'll go ahead and put a little line of black along the underside as a shadow. The silos have a shadow on the right-hand side. So I've painted some watered down black along the right-hand side, and I'm just going to wet that with water and bring that over to have a nice soft blend. I'm not going to, dry brush or anything like that. I'm just going to wet that and just have a nice soft blend, a nice soft edge. That's just with water. You want to make sure that that shadow is nice and dark. That's what's going to help those to stand out so that they're real visible for you to see. Same thing with the other one. Nice and dark on the right hand side, and then just soften that with water. I'm not going to be doing the tops until that is all dry. And when I do the tops, I'm just going to paint a little bit of color on that tops to those silos. And I am leaving the left hand side nice and white because that is where the light is shining. So I'm going to have a real rough edge on my shadowed part of the top to the silo. It's not just a straight up and down painted line. It's kind of like dry brushed off, but I'm not dry brushing. I'm just painting off the rough edge. But the right side is painted, the left side is left white. Now we want to go ahead and finish off the rest of our branches. Make sure you have all of your tree branches done. Paint them in with some umber and some black. Make sure you have enough branches to substantiate all of the foliage. You can't have all of that foliage and not have a lot of tree trunks and branches. Again, you can always add these in, so less is better. You can always add, but you can't take away. So, draw them and paint them where you think you want them. Step back away from it. If it looks like you have enough, then leave it alone. You don't want to get too carried away, but you want to have enough that makes it look like there's enough branches and tree trunks to substantiate all of that foliage. You can't have 2 tree trunks and 3 branches when you have, 17 trees or whatever. So you want to make sure you have enough and it looks interesting enough that you're not losing the picture because you don't have enough in it. Whatever is left, we're going to be painting the color of what would be behind that. So all of those empty spaces that are white, they're not going to be white. There's going to be color that's put in there, but we want to make sure that we have all of our branches and tree trunks in there first. Now we're going to start to paint in all of the background holes, all of those white holes that we put in by sponging. You want to think about what's behind that. What color is the field behind that? And you're just going to paint in all of those. This is just mindless painting. You can just paint in. It doesn't have to be perfect. If you go over the green with your color, that's perfectly fine. But whatever coloring you think is behind that, if it's a field color, if it's a yellow ochre field, if it's a green field, you just want to make sure that all of those white spots are painted in, because there should not be any white showing through. That goes for both sides of the road. No white unless it's the white of a barn roof. But other than that, there should not be any white spots visible. Now everything's painted in back there. It looks great. We're going to come back up to the foreground road. We want to add some dark sections into that road. You can either paint them on or you can simply dry brush them on. But I'm painting the tire track areas again with a darker steel gray. This is my cerulean and some black. And I am painting on the tire track, the tracks, the well-traveled sections of the road, painting those vertically, and then dry brushing off the edges horizontally, leaving some of the original color. I don't want just solid darker areas. I want there to be some lighter areas that, might be the beginning of a pothole or might be where a lot of stones are, but I don't want it just to be solid color. Look at your picture, kind of follow your picture the best you can, but most of this painting now is going to be dry brushed horizontally and just some thinner lines painted vertically. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove the rest of my misket, my grasses, any of my misket that's still left on there. I'm taking all of that misket off, and I'm going to be painting in those grasses. Again, you can paint those grasses whatever color you would like. If you would like them to be yellow ochre, that's fine. If you want them to be green, sap green, that's fine. If you have your misketing in an area that is all sap green, you may want to go ahead and use the same color for the areas that were misketed instead of changing the color. But you want to go ahead and paint all of those misketed lines in, because again, you shouldn't have any white left on your picture. Once your misket has all been painted in, then we're going to go ahead and use our wisp brush, and we're going to make some other grasses with your wisp or your fan brush. So I'm going to be using my Wisp brush to make some grasses. I'm going to use my sap color, and I'm just going to be doing some vertical grasses. I'm not doing it everywhere. I'm just picking out some sections that I want to have some grasses, maybe an area where your salt didn't work very well, or your coloring is very flat and you want to add a little bit of texturing. But I'm using that Wisp to go ahead and add some grasses. You can use sap, you can use your yellow ochre, you can even use burnt umber. But just, again, don't get too carried away with doing too much. You don't need that much. Just a few little areas with your Wisp and your grasses is all you need. You can do them on both sides if you prefer. But again, if you like an area, if an area is looking really good for you, then leave it alone. Don't put anything else additional. I added just a little bit of darker sap along the edge of my road where I wasn't really happy with how that looked. And then I'll pull that out with my Wisp so that it doesn't look like I just laid some dark color down. I'll make it be part of a section of grasses. You can do that with any section that you're not real happy with. You can change the color up, make it a little bit darker. You can add extra layers. If you like the yellow ochre but you're not happy with something, then just add another additional area of your yellow ochre. You don't have to change the color. Once you get all of your grasses done, then I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit of detail work. This is with my very fine liner. I'm going to make some little lines on my silo. This is just because I love doing all of that little detail work, so I'm going to deepen my shadow just a little bit. I'm going to add that pole that goes down the side of my silo, and then with my real fine liner, I'll make my horizontal lines along the silos. If you don't want to do that, that is strictly my personal opinion to do that, how I like to do things, but you certainly wouldn't have to do something that is that fine and that far in the distance. But now's the time that you want to go ahead and put in any details. If some of your trees look like they could be a little bit more leafy, go ahead and use your little fine brush and add some additional leaves. Now is when you want to do all of your little detail work. so that when we dry it well and remove all of the salt, the last thing we're going to be putting in is that deep dark shadow along the road from your trees. And that is what's really going to set your picture off, because it'll give you another reason to understand that it's a bright sunny day, you have heavy shadows on the road from your trees, and it'll make it all the more country looking. Okay, get all of the salt off of your road. We're going to be using our wisp and our regular brush. The shadows are going to come through the field also and across the street. So you want to use your wisp brush so that you can keep your shadow nice and grassy and wispy looking, the one that's on the hillside. You don't want just a straight line of shadow, because it's not a straight line. It's all different lengths of grasses. So I'm using my wisp and my watered down black, and I am working my shadow down the hillside, but I'm working it in a vertical way so that it's looking like it's just shadowing my grasses. I don't want a flat, straight line. I want my grasses in that area to be shadowed. So I'm going to have my edges pulled off on both the top and the bottom. And then that shadow is going to shoot straight across the road. So I'll go ahead and just use my round brush for that. It's a straight line across the road until it gets to the other side. And it's straight. You don't want it to be at an angle. It's going straight across. And then when it gets to the other side, it's going up a little tiny bit, and it'll be just a little bit uneven when it hits the grasses on the other side. There are two shadows. The other one is farther down. That one is going to be done the same way, but it comes off of that dark tree trunk. It's going to come off that tree trunk down onto the road at a little bit of an angle, and then it'll go straight across the road also. Now, once you're happy with your shadows, then look over your picture. In looking over my picture, I'm still thinking that I want my foreground road to be just a little bit darker in sections. So I want to wait for my shadows to go ahead and dry. Make sure that you put those shadows on your right side of your tree trunks. Get those shadows in there. It's just the big tree trunks, not all of your little branches, nothing like that, but you want to make sure they're nice and shadowed in. If there's any areas that you need to work on, you can go ahead and work on. Look at your picture, compare your picture to your painting, or compare your painting to what you are thinking in your mind that you like or you might not like. If you want to deepen a field, if you want to add another tree in the background, if you want to make your one tree darker, if you want to add a little bit of color to your tree. In my case, I want to make my road, my foreground road, just a little bit darker. So I'm using my cerulean and my black again, and I'm adding just a little bit of darker color into my road. It's a road well traveled, so I want to make it really look like it's been traveled. You can still add salting if you need to, but you just want to make sure that you're happy with it. I don't want all of my dark color to be on the left-hand side, so I'm bringing some through the center and I'll put some into the right side so that my painting doesn't look like it's all being pulled to the left. I want to have like a nice evener color. You always want to make sure you have that Kleenex handy also in case you need to blot something up that you didn't like. And now I think I'm happy. Don't ever finish until you're totally happy. Doesn't mean you have to be totally happy right now. You can finish tomorrow, but don't let it go until you're happy with it. And don't dare throw them away. You can always fix them up. So enjoy. Take a ride down this country road. Enjoy the beautiful summer weather. And definitely happy painting. See you again. We thank the Monroeville Library for supporting us and supporting this watercolor tutorial. And we'll see you for the next one.